From surviving on cornbread and beans as a kid to building one of the most feared cars on television, James "Doc" Love has lived a life far more dramatic than most fans realize. Between heart attacks during filming, barrel-rolling crashes that knocked down trees, and starting his own business with his grandfather, this diesel mechanic turned street racing legend has stories that will shock you. Here are 15 things you never knew about Doc from Street Outlaws. Fact 1. His family nearly starved to death. Most Street Outlaws fans know Doc as the tough guy behind the wheel of some of the most powerful cars on television, but what they don't know is that his childhood was marked by a level of poverty that's almost unimaginable today. James Love grew up in Moore, Oklahoma, as the son of a concrete construction worker, and his family's financial struggles were so severe that they regularly faced the very real threat of starvation. During the harsh Oklahoma winters, when construction work was scarce and his father couldn't find steady employment, the Love family was forced to survive on nothing but beans and cornbread for weeks at a time. In interviews, Doc has been surprisingly open about these difficult memories, explaining that they would literally go hungry for days during the coldest months when money was completely gone and food was running out. The situation was so desperate that Doc has described it as his family nearly starving to death, which wasn't an exaggeration but an actual fear they lived with every winter. The impact of this extreme poverty extended far beyond just being hungry. When summer arrived and school ended, young James couldn't just enjoy his break like other kids. Instead, he was forced to work all summer long, taking whatever jobs he could find just so the family would have enough money to buy clothes for him and his siblings to wear to school the following year. This meant that while other children were playing and enjoying their summer vacation, Doc was already learning the harsh realities of working to survive. Even something as basic as getting to school became a family challenge that required creative solutions. His parents eventually gave him their 1977 Monte Carlo, but this wasn't a generous gift from loving parents wanting to spoil their teenager. Instead, it was a practical necessity, because Doc needed to drive his younger brother and sister to school. And he also had to work jobs to earn money for gas to keep the car running. The responsibility of transportation for the entire family fell on his shoulders while he was still just a kid himself. These early experiences of poverty and responsibility shaped Doc into the determined, hard-working person that Street Outlaws fans see today. Though most viewers have no idea about the incredible adversity he overcame just to survive his childhood in Oklahoma. Fact 2. He got his first car as child labor. When most teenagers dream of getting their first car, they imagine freedom, independence, and maybe impressing friends at school. But Doc's experience with his first vehicle was completely different and far more complicated than anyone would expect. His parents didn't hand him the keys to their 1977 Monte Carlo as a reward for good grades or as a sweet 16th birthday present, but rather as a practical solution to a family problem that required him to take on adult responsibilities while he was still just a kid. The reality was that Doc's family desperately needed someone to handle transportation duties for the household, and since his parents were both working to try to keep the family afloat financially, that responsibility fell directly onto James's shoulders. His parents made it clear that the car came with strings attached, and those strings were pretty heavy for a teenager to carry. He was expected to drive his younger brother and sister to school every single day, which meant he couldn't sleep in, skip school, or make plans that would interfere with his siblings' schedules. But the responsibilities didn't stop there, because owning a car meant nothing if they couldn't afford to put gas in it. Doc was also required to work various jobs to earn money specifically for gas and basic car maintenance, turning what should have been a teenage milestone into essentially a part-time job with a company car. In his own words, Doc has explained that he was given his mom's car specifically so he could help his brother and sister get to school and so he could go to work to afford the gas needed to keep the transportation running. This arrangement meant that Doc's first car wasn't really his at all, but rather a family work vehicle that he happened to be the designated driver for. While other kids his age were learning to drive for fun and freedom, Doc was learning to drive out of necessity and family obligation. The Monte Carlo represented responsibility and work rather than the typical teenage car experience, and it set the stage for his lifelong relationship with cars being tied to practical problem-solving rather than just entertainment or status symbols. Fact 3. Street Outlaws filming started at his house. When Street Outlaws premiered on Discovery Channel in 2013 and became one of the biggest reality shows on television, most fans assumed the filming began at some dramatic location or maybe Big Chief's shop, but the truth is that the very first scenes of the entire franchise were actually shot right at Doc's house in Oklahoma City. This makes Doc's property literally ground zero for what would eventually become a multi-million-dollar television empire that spawned numerous spin-offs and made household names out of street racers from Oklahoma. The story of how this happened is almost as surprising as the fact itself, because it all started with the crew's participation in an online discussion board called Midwest Street Cars, where they would argue with each other and challenge each other to races. One day, someone claiming to be from Pilgrim Studios reached out through the website saying they were interested in filming the group and asked if they wanted to be on television. Big Chief, who was naturally suspicious of the whole thing, told them that if they were legitimate, they needed to call him directly rather than just sending messages through the internet. When the production team from Pilgrim Media Group actually did follow through and make contact, they decided to start filming immediately, and Doc's house became the location where they set up their cameras and began capturing the footage that would eventually become the pilot episode of Street Outlaws. The choice wasn't made because Doc had the nicest house or the best location, but rather because it was convenient. And the producers needed to start somewhere while they figured out how this whole television experiment was going to work. What makes this even more interesting is that many of the drivers, including Doc himself, were incredibly suspicious about the whole situation when filming first began. Some of the crew members were convinced that these so-called television producers were actually undercover police officers running a sting operation to catch them participating in illegal street racing activities. The paranoia was so strong that several drivers seriously considered not showing up to film because they thought they might end up getting arrested instead of becoming television stars. Fact 4. He bought his famous car site, unseen. In an era when most people wouldn't buy a used toaster without seeing it in person first, Doc made one of the boldest automotive purchases in Street Outlaws history by buying his legendary 1970 Chevrolet Monte Carlo completely sight unseen through eBay from a seller in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This wasn't just any car purchase either, but the vehicle that would eventually become known as the Street Beast and make him famous on national television, yet he committed to buying it based on nothing more than online photos and the seller's word about its condition. The purchase happened in 2003 when eBay was still relatively new, and buying cars online was considered extremely risky by most people, especially when the transaction involved traveling hundreds of miles to pick up a vehicle that might not even run properly. Doc had reached a point of financial stability with his diesel repair shop and decided it was time to invest in a serious race car. But instead of shopping locally or traveling to see cars in person like most buyers would do, he took a massive gamble on this Monte Carlo listing he found online. What makes this story even more incredible is that after winning the eBay auction and sending his money to a complete stranger in Wisconsin, Doc then had to make the long drive from Oklahoma City all the way to Milwaukee to pick up his purchase, not knowing whether he'd be driving home in his dream car or getting stuck with a piece of junk that barely ran. The distance between the two cities is over 600 miles, which meant that if the car turned out to be a disaster, he'd be facing either an expensive towing bill or a very long bus ride home. Fortunately for Doc and for Street Outlaws fans everywhere, The gamble paid off in spectacular fashion. When he finally got his hands on the Monte Carlo and took it to the track for its first test run, the car went 12.27 seconds right off the trailer, without any modifications or tuning, which immediately convinced him that he'd found something special. That single eBay purchase, made completely on faith and without any physical inspection, ended up launching his entire racing career and eventually led to his starring role on one of Discovery Channel's most popular shows. Fact 5. He had the largest engine in show history. When it comes to engine sizes in the world of Street Outlaws, most drivers are already pushing the limits with their big block motors and supercharged setups. But Doc took things to an entirely different level by cramming a truly massive 959 cubic inch mountain motor into his street beast that reportedly became the largest engine ever used by any racer in the entire, for him, Street Outlaws franchise. To put this in perspective for people who aren't familiar with car engines, most regular cars on the road today have engines that are somewhere between 150 and 400 cubic inches, which means Doc's engine was more than twice the size of even the biggest engines you'd find in a typical muscle car. The 959 cubic inch motor wasn't something Doc started with when he first bought his Monte Carlo, but rather the result of his constant quest to go faster and his willingness to push his car beyond what anyone else was doing on the show. This massive engine represented years of modifications and upgrades as Doc continuously searched for more power and speed to compete with the other elite racers in the 405 crew. The sheer physical size of this motor meant that significant modifications had to be made to the car itself just to fit the engine under the hood and make everything work together properly. Building and maintaining an engine of this size required not only a huge financial investment, but also specialized knowledge about how to handle that much power without destroying the rest of the car's components. The 959 cubic inch motor produced so much horsepower and torque that it created constant challenges for Doc in terms of getting all that power to the ground effectively and keeping his car in one piece during races. Many of the mechanical issues and struggles that viewers saw Doc dealing with on the show were directly related to the difficulties of managing such an enormous amount of power from this record-breaking engine. The fact that Doc was willing to go bigger than anyone else in the franchise shows his commitment to winning and his philosophy that there's no such thing as too much power when you're trying to be the fastest car on the list. Fact 6. The cast initially thought producers were cops. When the cameras first started rolling for what would eventually become Street Outlaws, Doc and several other members of the 405 crew were absolutely convinced that the people claiming to be television producers were actually undercover police officers, running an elaborate sting operation to catch them participating in illegal street racing activities. This paranoia wasn't just casual suspicion either, but serious concern that had some drivers genuinely considering whether they should participate in filming at all because they thought there was a real chance they might end up in handcuffs instead of on television. The suspicion made perfect sense when you consider the context of what these guys were doing before the show started, because street racing was, and still is, illegal in most places, and law enforcement agencies had been known to use undercover operations to catch racers in the act. When strangers suddenly appeared claiming they wanted to film illegal racing activities for a major television network, it was only natural for experienced street racers to assume this was some kind of trap, designed to gather evidence that could be used to prosecute them later. The fear was so strong among the crew that even after Pilgrim Studios had made initial contact and begun setting up their equipment, many of the drivers remained convinced that this was all an elaborate ruse and that police officers were about to start making arrests at any moment. Doc and the others kept expecting badges to come out and handcuffs to appear, especially since the whole situation seemed almost too good to be true for a group of guys who had been operating in the shadows of illegal racing for years. What made the situation even more surreal was that the producers had to work extra hard to convince the racers that they were legitimate television people rather than law enforcement officers, which meant spending considerable time proving their credentials and explaining exactly how a legal television show could be made about illegal street racing activities. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved that a group of people who made their living breaking traffic laws were now worried about being caught by the very people who were trying to make them famous for breaking those same laws on national television. Fact 7. He suffered a heart attack. While filming, in 2018, just when Doc was preparing for what should have been an exciting No Prep Kings racing event at Summit Motorsports Park in Ohio, his weekend took a terrifying turn when he suffered a major heart attack that required immediate emergency medical intervention and completely derailed his racing plans. This wasn't just a minor health scare or chest pains that turned out to be nothing serious, but a full-blown cardiac emergency that put his life in real danger and required doctors to perform emergency surgery to save him. The timing of the heart attack couldn't have been worse from a racing perspective, because Doc had traveled all the way to Ohio specifically to compete in this particular No Prep Kings event, and he had been looking forward to testing his car against some of the best no prep racers in the country. Instead of spending his weekend on the racetrack, trying to climb up the rankings and prove himself against the competition, Doc found himself lying in a hospital bed while doctors worked to repair the damage to his heart and restore proper blood flow to the affected areas. The medical procedure required surgeons to insert 3 stents into Doc's coronary arteries, which are tiny mesh tubes designed to keep blocked arteries open and allow blood to flow freely to the heart muscle. This type of surgery, while relatively common today, is still a serious medical procedure that requires careful monitoring and recovery time, especially for someone whose lifestyle involves the high stress and physical demands of competitive racing. Doc handled the entire situation with his characteristic straightforward honesty, taking to social media to update his fans about what had happened rather than trying to hide the medical emergency or downplay its seriousness. In his typical no-nonsense style, he shared details about the heart attack, the surgery, and the 3 stents, while expressing gratitude for the medical team that treated him and acknowledging that his stubborn personality probably helped him get through the ordeal. The incident served as a stark reminder that even the toughest street racers aren't immune to serious health problems, and that the stress of high-level competition can take a real toll on the human body. Fact 8. His crash knocked down 3 trees. Car crashes in racing are unfortunately common, but Doc's devastating accident in Nebraska during 2020 involved a level of destruction that was almost unbelievable, with his Monte Carlo crashing with such tremendous force that it actually knocked 3 mature cedar trees completely off at ground level during the chaos of the wreck. To understand just how incredible this is, these weren't small saplings or thin young trees, but solid cedar trees that measured between 8 and 10 inches in diameter, which means they were substantial, well-established trees that would normally require a chainsaw and considerable effort to cut down. The accident happened while Doc was filming what he described as a very important race for the original Street Outlaws series in Nebraska, and what started as a high-speed racing incident quickly turned into one of the most violent crashes in the show's history. Doc's beloved street beast veered off the racing surface and began barrel rolling in a series of flips that he later estimated to be between 5 and 6 complete rotations, with each roll adding more momentum and destructive force to the already out-of-control vehicle. The fact that the rolling car had enough energy and mass to snap 3 trees clean off at ground level gives you some idea of just how violent and chaotic this crash really was, because trees of that size are incredibly strong and deeply rooted. Yet the force of Doc's tumbling Monte Carlo was powerful enough to break them like they were twigs. The trees didn't just get damaged or bent, but were completely severed at ground level, which means the car was moving with enough force to overcome the natural strength and flexibility that allows trees to survive high winds and storms. Doc himself described the scene by explaining that his car barrel rolled 5 to 6 times and knocked 3 8 to 10-inch round cedar trees clean off at the ground, which paints a picture of absolute destruction that's hard to imagine unless you've witnessed something similar in person. The crash completely totaled his street beast, ending the career of a car that had been his racing partner for over a decade and forcing him to say goodbye to the vehicle that had made him famous on Street Outlaws. Fact 9. He was unconscious for half an hour. The severity of Doc's 2020 Nebraska crash becomes even more shocking when you learn that the impact was so violent it knocked him completely unconscious for somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, leaving him with absolutely no memory of the accident itself, or even the race that led up to the devastating wreck. For anyone who has never experienced a serious concussion, it's hard to understand just how frightening it is to lose that much time and have your memory completely wiped clean, especially when you're told later that something life-threatening happened during those missing minutes. Doc's unconscious state lasted long enough that it created serious concern among the film crew and other racers who witnessed the crash. Because when someone doesn't wake up immediately after a car accident, it usually means they've suffered significant head trauma that could have lasting consequences. The fact that he remained unconscious for such an extended period indicates just how severe the impact was when his head struck the interior of the car during the violent barrel-rolling sequence that destroyed his Monte Carlo. When Doc finally regained consciousness and began to recover from the immediate effects of the crash, he discovered that the concussion had created a complete blank spot in his memory that covered not just the accident itself, but also the entire race that had been taking place when everything went wrong. This type of memory loss is actually a common symptom of severe concussions, but it's still disturbing for the person experiencing it because they essentially lose a chunk of their life that they can never get back, no matter how hard they try to remember what happened. The concussion symptoms didn't just disappear once Doc woke up either, because he continued to struggle with the effects of his head injury long after the initial accident occurred. In his own social media posts about the crash, Doc admitted that he was still dealing with symptoms from the bad concussion, which can include headaches, dizziness, confusion, and difficulty concentrating that can persist for weeks or even months after the original injury. The extended unconsciousness and ongoing concussion symptoms served as a stark reminder of just how dangerous high-speed racing can be, even for experienced drivers who think they've seen everything. Fact 10. He co-owns his shop with his grandfather. While many fans assume that Doc built his successful diesel repair business entirely on his own after becoming famous on Street Outlaws, the truth is that Southwest Diesel Service was actually founded in 2001 as a partnership between Doc and his grandfather, making it a genuine multi-generational family operation that has been running for over 2 decades now. This family business arrangement is pretty unusual in today's world, where most young entrepreneurs prefer to start their own companies independently rather than going into business with older family members who might have different ideas about how things should be run. The decision to partner with his grandfather wasn't just about having someone to help with the financial investment needed to start a repair shop, but also about combining Doc's formal education and technical training from the Universal Technical Institute with his grandfather's decades of hands-on experience working with diesel engines and heavy machinery. This combination of new school knowledge and old school practical wisdom created a business foundation that was much stronger than either man could have built on his own, especially in the competitive world of diesel repair, where customers need to trust that their expensive equipment will be fixed correctly the first time. What makes this partnership even more interesting is that Doc has maintained this business relationship with his grandfather throughout his entire rise to fame on Street Outlaws, even when the television show and racing commitments started taking up more and more of his time and attention. Many reality television stars end up abandoning their previous careers once they become successful on television. But Doc has consistently made it clear that Southwest Diesel Service isn't just a business to him, but something special that represents his family's legacy and his commitment to the community that supported him before he became famous. The fact that he still actively works at the shop alongside his grandfather, even while dealing with the demands of filming multiple seasons of Street Outlaws and competing in No Prep Kings events across the country, shows a level of dedication to family and traditional values that's pretty rare among television personalities. This ongoing partnership has allowed the business to continue serving customers in Oklahoma City, while also giving Doc a stable source of income that doesn't depend on the unpredictable world of reality television and street racing. Fact 11. He uses psychological warfare on opponents. While most Street Outlaws fans focus on the cars and the racing action, Doc has proven himself to be a master of psychological warfare, who deliberately uses mind games and mental tactics to gain advantages over his opponents before they even get to the starting line. The most documented example of this strategy happened during his interactions with fellow racer James Goad, who goes by the nickname Reaper, when Doc employed a calculated campaign of mental manipulation designed to throw his opponent completely off his game and make him doubt his own abilities. The psychological tactics started when Reaper challenged Doc for his position on the list, which should have been a straightforward racing situation where the two drivers would simply line up their cars and settle the matter with a head-to-head race. Instead of accepting the challenge immediately, like most racers would do, Doc made the strategic decision to refuse the race initially, using his higher list position as leverage to frustrate and anger his opponent by making it clear that he didn't have to accept any challenge whenever someone lower on the list demanded it. But Doc didn't stop there with his mental games, because he also made sure to constantly remind Reaper about their respective positions on the list and rub it in his face that he was ranked higher, which was designed to create doubt and anxiety in his opponent's mind about whether he was really good enough to compete at Doc's level. This type of psychological pressure can be incredibly effective in racing because confidence plays such a huge role in a driver's performance, and if you can make someone question their own abilities or get them emotionally worked up before a race, you've already gained a significant advantage before the engines even start. The mind games worked exactly as Doc had planned, because when they finally did race against each other, Reaper was visibly frustrated and emotionally charged rather than being calm and focused like he needed to be for optimal performance. Doc not only won the race and kept his higher list position, but he later admitted that this particular victory was actually his favorite win because of how perfectly his psychological strategy had worked to give him the edge he needed to beat a very capable opponent. Fact 12. The show was discovered through online trash talk. The origins of Street Outlaws as a television phenomenon are far more unusual than most fans realize, because the entire show actually started when Doc and the rest of the 405 crew were discovered by television producers through their participation in an online discussion board called Midwest Streetcars, where they would regularly engage in heated arguments and trash talk with each other using screen names and anonymous usernames. This was long before social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter became popular, so online discussion boards were one of the main ways that people with similar interests could connect and communicate with each other across different cities and states. According to Doc himself, the dynamic on this discussion board was pretty intense and competitive, with all the racers using fake names to hide their real identities while they would cuss each other out, call each other out, and make challenges that they would then have to back up in person during weekend racing meetups. The online arguments weren't just casual conversation or friendly banter, but serious trash talking, where reputations were on the line, and racers would make bold claims about their cars and their driving abilities that they knew they'd have to prove when they met face to face. The whole system worked like an early version of social media drama, where the racers would spend their weekdays building up tension and making threats through their computer screens, then gather on weekends to settle all their disputes through actual racing, rather than just continuing to argue online. This created a natural cycle of conflict and resolution that kept the racing scene exciting and gave everyone motivation to keep improving their cars and their driving skills. The transition from online discussion board to television show happened when someone claiming to be from Pilgrim Studios posted a message on the Midwest Street Cars board asking if the group would be interested in being filmed for a non-self potential television show. Big Chief, who was naturally suspicious of anyone reaching out through the internet, told them they'd have to prove they were legitimate by calling him directly, and that simple exchange eventually led to Discovery Channel finding this group of racers in what Doc described as the middle of the United States and turning their weekend hobby into a multi-million-dollar television franchise. Fact 13. He has multiple car personas. Most racers simply give their cars a name and stick with it throughout their racing career, but Doc has developed a fascinating habit of treating each of his different vehicles like completely separate personalities with distinct identities, carefully choosing names that reflect not just the car's appearance, but also its intended purpose and character in the racing world. This approach to naming his cars goes far beyond the typical practice of just slapping a cool-sounding label on a vehicle, because Doc genuinely seems to view each car as having its own unique personality and role in his racing story. The most famous of these automotive personalities was the Street Beast, which was the name Doc gave to his legendary 1970 Monte Carlo that made him famous on Street Outlaws and carried him through most of his television career. The name perfectly captured the aggressive, intimidating nature of the car and Doc's racing style, suggesting something wild and dangerous that was ready to attack anyone brave enough to challenge it on the street or track. When Doc was forced to move on from the Street Beast after his devastating Nebraska crash, he didn't just pick any random name for his replacement vehicle, but instead chose Stunt Double for his 1998 Pontiac Firebird, which was a clever reference to the fact that this car was essentially stepping in to perform the same role that the Street Beast had played in his racing career. The name suggested that while this Firebird might look different from his Monte Carlo, it was designed to deliver the same kind of performance and fill the same spot in Doc's racing lineup. Most recently, Doc purchased a 1974 Chevrolet Nova that he renamed Heavy Metal, which represents yet another distinct personality in his growing collection of automotive characters. This name suggests something powerful, loud, and aggressive, but with a different attitude than either the Street Beast or the Stunt Double had possessed. The fact that Doc takes the time to carefully consider these names and treats each car like it has its own identity shows a level of personal connection to his vehicles that goes well beyond the typical relationship between a driver and their racing equipment. Fact 14. He runs a secret merchandise empire. While most Street Outlaws fans know about Doc's racing career and his diesel repair shop, very few people are aware that he has quietly built a third business venture by operating his own merchandise website at thestreetbeast.com, where he sells branded clothing, memorabilia, and other items designed to capitalize on his television fame and racing reputation. This online business represents a completely different side of Doc's entrepreneurial spirit, showing that he understands the value of his personal brand and isn't afraid to turn his Street Outlaws success into additional income streams beyond just racing prize money and television appearances. The website operates somewhat under the radar compared to his more visible racing activities, which is probably intentional because Doc has always preferred to let his actions speak louder than his marketing efforts, but it does provide fans with a way to purchase official Doc-branded merchandise rather than having to settle for generic Street Outlaws items that don't specifically represent their favorite driver. The fact that he took the time and effort to set up his own independent website rather than just selling through Discovery Channel's official merchandise channels shows that Doc is serious about maintaining control over his personal brand and maximizing the financial benefits of his television fame. This merchandise operation fits perfectly with Doc's practical, business-minded approach to life because he has consistently shown that he understands the importance of having multiple sources of income rather than relying entirely on racing winnings or television contracts that could disappear at any time. The website allows him to generate ongoing revenue from his Street Outlaws popularity, even during periods when he's not actively racing or when the show might be between seasons, providing a steady income stream that complements his other business activities. The choice to use thestreetbeast.com as his web address is particularly clever because it directly connects the merchandise business to his most famous car and racing identity, making it easy for fans to remember and find the site, while also reinforcing the brand recognition that he's built up over years of appearing on Street Outlaws and competing in No Prep Kings events across the country. Fact 15. His car is literally set on kill. When Doc talks about his street beast being set on kill for anyone brave enough to challenge him, most fans assume this is just typical racing trash talk or colorful language designed to intimidate his opponents, but the reality is that this phrase has actually become so closely associated with Doc and his car that Discovery Channel adopted it as the official description in their promotional materials and driver biographies. This means that what started as Doc's personal way of describing his Monte Carlo's aggressive setup has now become the car's actual documented identity in the television network's official records and marketing campaigns. The phrase perfectly captures Doc's approach to racing and his philosophy about what his car represents on the track, because set on kill suggests that the vehicle isn't just fast or competitive, but actively dangerous and ready to destroy anyone who gets in its way during a race. This isn't the kind of language you'd typically expect to see in corporate promotional materials from a major television network, but Discovery Channel clearly recognized that Doc's authentic street racing attitude was exactly what made the show appealing to audiences who wanted to see real personalities rather than sanitized television characters. The fact that this phrase became official enough to appear in Discovery Channel's promotional content shows just how much Doc's authentic personality and original way of expressing himself influenced the entire Street Outlaws brand and helped shape how the network presented the show to potential viewers. Instead of trying to tone down his aggressive language or make him sound more corporate-friendly, the producers embraced Doc's raw, unfiltered way of talking about racing and made it part of the show's official identity. This official adoption of Doc's set-on-kill description also demonstrates how the success of Street Outlaws was built on the genuine personalities of the racers rather than scripted dialogue or manufactured drama, because television networks don't usually allow cast members' casual phrases to become part of their official promotional language unless those phrases really capture something authentic and valuable about the show's appeal. The phrase has become so strongly connected to Doc's racing identity that it appears on official Street Outlaws websites and Discovery Channel biographical information as the standard way to describe his car's attitude, capabilities,